In the late 16th century, silver became the lifeblood of two empires that had never met but were bound by invisible chains of trade. On one side was Spain, drunk on the wealth of the New World, extracting mountains of silver from the mines of Potosí and Zacatecas with brutal efficiency. On the other side stood China, under the Ming dynasty, the most advanced civilization on Earth, an empire so vast and bureaucratically complex that even the emperor's word needed a medium of exchange strong enough to make it real. That medium would be silver. It would bring prosperity, stability, and ultimately, collapse. Spain's ships, loaded with treasure from the Americas, set sail across oceans in a new global network of exchange. At first, the metal flowed to Europe, but European markets quickly drowned in it. Prices rose, inflation spread, and demand for the silver coins known as pieces of 8 fell. But in China, silver was treasure incarnate. After a century of failed paper money experiments that had ended in ruinous inflation, the Ming government turned back to hard currency. Taxes, trade, salaries, all required silver. The empire's need for metal was insatiable, and Spain had an endless supply. Through the Manila galleons, colossal ships sailing between the Philippines and Mexico, Spain and China were tied together in the first truly global economy. Every year, these vessels carried tons of silver across the Pacific to Manila, where Chinese merchants eagerly traded silk, porcelain, and tea in exchange. The galleons then returned to Acapulco, filled with the finest goods of the East, ready for resale in Seville and Antwerp. The system was perfect. One empire's surplus fed the other's hunger. The world economy pulsed to the rhythm of silver. But underneath the shimmering surface, imbalance grew. China's economy was being restructured around a single foreign metal, one it could not produce itself. The Ming government, desperate to maintain order, had fixed its tax system in silver, forcing peasants to obtain the metal no matter the cost. For millions of farmers who earned their living in grain, copper, or labor, this was a trap. They had to sell their crops to acquire silver, often at terrible exchange rates. Wealth began to flow upward, from the countryside to the elite, from the people to the state. The more silver poured in, the higher prices climbed. A market that once ran on balance began to suffocate under inflation. The merchants and landlords who hoarded silver saw their fortunes grow, while peasants sank into debt. Land changed hands, poverty spread, and resentment simmered beneath the empire's polished order. China had become addicted to silver, its economy booming with every shipment from across the sea, its stability dependent on the fortunes of a distant continent. In Spain, the consequences were just as corrosive. The silver that filled the empire's treasuries didn't create wealth. It destroyed discipline. Why build industries or train artisans when galleons could bring endless riches from America? Spanish kings used silver to pay for wars, mercenaries, and luxuries. Inflation spread across Europe, devouring real wages and hollowing out entire economies. By the 17th century, Spain was rich only in metal and bankrupt in everything else. For a time, both empires appeared strong, but the foundation beneath them was dissolving. Silver was not wealth. It was a mirror. It reflected strength until the flow stopped. And when it did, everything that relied on it began to crack. By the 1630s, the mines of Potosí started to slow. Exhausted veins, rebellion, and mismanagement reduced production. Trade routes became dangerous as pirates and privateers hunted the treasure fleets. Across the Pacific, in Manila, the shipments that once arrived like clockwork became irregular and small. China's economy, now fully dependent on imported silver, convulsed. The value of silver skyrocketed. Taxes fixed in silver became impossible to pay. Peasants sold land, tools, and family heirlooms to meet obligations that doubled in value every year. Entire provinces collapsed into famine. Local officials, starved of revenue, rebelled. Soldiers went unpaid. The emperor's decrees lost their weight. And as rebellion spread, one truth became undeniable. The wealth that once fueled China's prosperity had turned toxic. When the Ming dynasty finally fell in 1644, historians blamed corruption, invasion, and rebellion. But beneath those familiar explanations was a quieter, more insidious cause: monetary dependence. The empire had built its fiscal system on a foreign resource it could not control. When that resource vanished, so did its power. Spain's silver had poisoned China not with intent, but with inevitability. Every empire that becomes dependent on external wealth eventually pays the same price. When the Ming dynasty collapsed, China's relationship with silver did not end. It evolved. The new Qing rulers inherited not just an empire, but an addiction. They restored order, reformed the bureaucracy, and stabilized the currency. But they never broke the habit. Silver remained the bloodstream of the Chinese economy. Every tax, every salary, every transaction flowed through it. The Qing court prided itself on prudence and balance, yet it depended entirely on the same foreign metal that had crippled its predecessors. Every ingot that entered China came from beyond its borders, mostly through European traders who had replaced the Spanish galleons with their own ships. The Dutch, the Portuguese, and eventually the British carried the same silver, stamped with new faces but serving the same purpose. China's exports, silk, porcelain, tea, flooded the markets of London and Amsterdam. The silver that returned seemed infinite, and with it, confidence grew. But confidence is not control. As Europe industrialized, the balance began to shift. The West no longer wanted just Chinese goods. It wanted Chinese access. The problem was that China didn't buy enough in return. For over a century, silver had flowed one way, into China, draining European treasuries. To fix this imbalance, Britain found a new export that the Chinese could not resist and the government could not control: opium. In the late 18th century, British merchants began smuggling opium from India into China. The results were immediate and devastating. Demand exploded and silver, once pouring into the empire, began to flow out. It was an exact inversion of the 17th century, where silver had once poisoned China through abundance. Now it was draining the empire through addiction. The Qing government outlawed the trade, but enforcement was impossible. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy. Officials were bribed with the very metal they were meant to protect, and millions became dependent on the drug that financed their own decline. By the 1830s, the imbalance was unsustainable. The British East India Company had perfected the cycle: sell opium for silver, use silver to buy tea, and sell tea for profit in Europe. The empire that had once dominated global trade was being drained from within by the same metal that had once sustained it. The situation was financial warfare, disguised as commerce. When the Qing government tried to intervene, confiscating opium and banning British traders, London responded with force. The Opium Wars were not fought over morality or sovereignty. They were fought over balance sheets. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 ended the First War, forcing China to open its ports, pay massive indemnities, and cede territory. The indemnities, of course, had to be paid in silver. Within a decade, the empire's reserves collapsed. For centuries, China had been the sinkhole of the world's silver. Now it was hemorrhaging the same metal to pay for its own subjugation. The poison had come full circle. The drain of silver after the Opium Wars marked the beginning of China's century of humiliation. Economically weakened, politically fractured, and socially addicted, the empire became a shadow of its former power. The same monetary dependency that had made it rich in the Ming era now chained it to a foreign system of trade and debt. And behind every treaty, every port opening, every foreign concession, there was always silver demanded, counted, and shipped out of Chinese vaults. Silver had once symbolized stability. By the late 19th century, it represented surrender. Meanwhile, in the West, silver was losing its importance. The great powers shifted to gold. Britain adopted the gold standard, and others followed. Silver, the metal that had once defined a global economy, was now treated as a relic, abundant, inferior, unstable. The irony was painful. China, which had built its fiscal identity around silver, was now tethered to a currency no one else respected. This shift devastated China's monetary system. As global silver prices fell, the value of Chinese currency collapsed with them. Inflation ravaged the countryside. Wages lost meaning. The empire could not stabilize its finances without switching to gold, but doing so required reserves it no longer possessed. The very metal that had once anchored the empire now dragged it deeper into the abyss. And yet, the pattern didn't end with silver. It merely changed form. When the 20th century began and paper money replaced metal around the world, the same dependency reemerged. Only now it was tied to foreign credit instead of foreign coin. The flow of value remained global, asymmetric, and dangerous. In a way, Spanish silver was the first globalization, the original example of how an external resource could transform an economy, enrich a few, and enslave many. It taught the world a truth that no empire wanted to admit. Trade is never equal when one side controls a currency. Even today, the echoes of that lesson remain. The global dollar system functions on the same principle that bound Ming China to Spanish silver, dependence disguised as stability. Nations hold reserves not because they trust the metal or the issuer, but because they fear what happens if they don't. Value, once measured in weight, is now measured in belief. The poison hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. The story of silver is not a relic of the past. It's a mirror of the present. In the 16th century, China became addicted to a currency it couldn't produce. In the 21st, much of the world has done the same. Only this time, the mine is a U.S. treasury and the galleons are digital. The silver ships of Spain may have stopped sailing centuries ago, but their wake still ripples through global markets. Each economic crisis, each currency collapse, each debt spiral is another reminder that dependency never ends well. The poison changes form, but the result is always the same. Control shifts to those who print, not those who produce. Silver once gave China power, then took it away. It made Spain rich, then hollowed it out. It created the first global economy, and then destroyed its balance. It was not just metal. It was a lesson in the cost of trust. And that is why this story still matters. Because every empire believes its money will last forever. Every government thinks control of the flow means control of the world. But history whispers otherwise. The metal that built empires also buried them. And somewhere beneath the surface of today's markets, the same pattern is quietly waiting to repeat.